Hey everyone, this is MusicTechHelpGuy, and welcome to part 49 of my ultimate guide to Logic Pro. In this video, I'm going to show you several sidechaining techniques. Sidechaining can be used as a musical effect, it can be used as a way to create space in a mix, or it can be used for creative sound design. So in this video, I'm going to show you 1, how to duck the level of a bass or other instruments with a kick drum. This is the most stereotypical use of this effect in electronic music. 2, how to use sidechaining as a mixing technique. And 3, how to use it within synthesizers that support a sidechain input. Now, I should take a moment to explain what a sidechain actually is, because in recent years, this term has more or less become synonymous with effects like this. So what is a sidechain? A sidechain is when you feed the signal of a track or instrument into a plugin or hardware device on another track. You can then use the signal level of the first track to affect some parameter on the second track, like using the level of a kick drum to control the amount of compression in a compressor, therefore creating the sidechain ducking effect I just played for you. There are other elements as well, like filtering the sidechain signal and using sidechain inputs in creative ways that we'll also cover in this video. But before we get into the tutorial, I want to quickly tell you about the sponsor of this video, Boombox. If you're a producer or mixing engineer and you're looking for a fresh new way to collaborate with and collect feedback from your clients, look no further than boombox.io. Boombox allows you to upload your tracks and invite your collaborators and clients to a project who can then leave time-stamped production notes and mixing feedback on the tracks. Once you've made revisions, you can upload new versions of the track to the project. As a mixing engineer, Boombox helps me easily collect feedback from my mixing clients and turn around quick mixing revisions. But don't take my word for it, try it out for yourself. Head over to boombox.io and sign up today to get 4 GB of free storage. Okay, so first let's start with the most stereotypical effect, the sidechain compression ducking effect. So in this project, I've got a full drum kit, an isolated kick drum, sort of a low sub-bass synth, and then another synth playing some chords. So to start, I'm just going to mute my original drum kit and my synth chords and start with just the kick and bass. So here's what this sounds like right now. So what we want to do is we want to create an effect where the kick drum ducks the volume of the bass on every kick hit. So the way this works is you're going to add a compressor to the bass instrument. And this could be any other instrument. I'm going to do this with the synthesizer in just a bit. And if you have your kick inside of a full drum set or full drum kit, I'm going to show you how to do that as well in just a bit. So the basic premise, again, is that you just put a compressor on the bass. I'm going to just use Logic's compressor for this because Logic's compressor has a sidechain input. And that sidechain input is right here. Now, normally the sidechain input in the compressor is internal, meaning that the compressor uses the internal signal of, the bass to determine how much compression is applied. But if you choose a sidechain external input from another track, like the kick drum, for example, you can use the kick drum's level to control how much compression is taking place. So if I just, run the compressor as is, you're just going to see some steady compression based on the level of the bass. So the level of gain reduction is pretty consistent. So what I'm going to do is go up to the sidechain input here, and you can choose audio tracks here if you have an audio track. You can choose instrument tracks, and you can also choose buses. So if you want to route something, say, from an aux track, you can do that as well. So I'm going to go to instrument here, And I'm going to choose this instrument right here, just this isolated kick. Now, what you're seeing here are all of the individual channels within my Drum Machine Designer kit here. But this one right here, kick, that's the isolated kick drum. So now what happens is the level of the kick drum is going to control the amount of compression taking place. So every single time that kick hits, the compressor applies some gain reduction. And what you can do with this is you can really exaggerate the ratio and threshold, play around with the attack and release time, and dial in something that almost completely gates the bass drum on the kick hits. So if you want the top of the signal to be even louder, you can try pulling up the makeup gain and pulling down the threshold and pulling up the ratio to get a really drastic effect. Now, one other thing I want to explain here is that in this situation, the kick drum is considered the sidechain source, and the bass, the compressor on the bass, is considered the sidechain target. So the source is what's applying the signal, the target is what's receiving the signal. One of the cool things about this effect and using sidechain inputs is that you can actually mute the original track, and you'll still hear the effect on the track. So you'll still hear the ducking effect, and the level of this track is still going to affect the compressor even when the kick drum is muted. And maybe I want it to be on this synthesizer as well. All I need to do is throw the compressor on this track. And then once again, I just set up the sidechain input to receive signal from my kick track. So again, these instruments are ducking and getting out of the way every single time that kick hits. Now, if you want to make the kick drum inside of an existing drum kit be the sidechain source, you can also do this. All you have to do is go into the compressor and change the sidechain source to the kit piece or the subtrack inside of your Drum Machine Designer kit. So all of these tracks are actually subtracks inside of Drum Machine Designer. So all I need to do is choose the appropriate kick drum, and now that track inside of Drum Machine Designer will be the one that is supplying signal down to the sidechain input on the compressor. And I'll do the same thing for my synth as well. I'll just choose kick 1. And one other thing to notice here is that when you have a sidechain input used in the compressor, you see this little extra arrow on the insert slot, and you'll also see the gain reduction moving down at the pace of the kick drum. Now, let's say that instead of working with an instrument, you're working with a full drum loop where there's more than just kick drum in the drum loop. Like here, I've just taken that whole beat and I've rendered it down to audio. What you can do is you can actually filter the sidechain signal so that mostly just the instrument that you want in the drum loop can be your sidechain trigger event, you know? So like for the kick drum, it would be the low frequencies. I would need to filter the sidechain signal to isolate just the low frequencies. Now, I'm not going to put the filter on the drums itself. You can actually do this inside of the compressor. So if I set up my sidechain, if I go to audio and I use drums now, At a certain point in the song here at bar 10 there, the hi-hats come in. And I don't want the hi-hats to trigger the gain reduction, but right now it's going to do that. It's actually doing pretty well because the kick is so much louder than the other elements in the drum loop. But you can focus this even more by going to sidechain here. You can turn on a sidechain filter, and what this will do is it'll filter the sidechain signal coming into the compressor. It doesn't actually filter the track itself. It just filters the signal coming into the sidechain input. So for example, I could say, okay, I want this to be low passed, and I want to roll this down to like 200 or 300 hertz. So only the signal from 200 hertz and lower is going to trigger the sidechain. It's going to trigger the ducking effect. And if you want to listen to that sidechain filter, you can click the listen button here. So I can really filter out anything in that drum loop that isn't the bottom end frequency of the kick drum. And then when I turn it on, it's just going to apply the ducking effect normally. And then I could do the same thing on the synth as well. What I'll do is I'll just hold Option and duplicate this over. And now I've got that same ducking effect on both of these tracks. Now, one of my favorite things to do with this sidechain ducking effect is to mix it up with bass and synthesizers that have arpeggiators on them. So off screen, I swapped out the bass sound and the synth sound, and I added in some new sounds that are kind of more classic, 80s sounding synth sounds. And I've added the arpeggiator to give both the bass and the synthesizer some motion. So without the sidechain compression ducking, this is what it sounds like as is. It's cool, but everything sounds like it's colliding together. So what I can do is bring in those sidechain ducking compressors. I'm using the exact same settings as I was before, and now it sounds like this. And another thing you can do is you can try experimenting with reverbs before and after the compressor. So I really love putting like heavy reverbs before the compressor because then the ambience of the reverb will also get ducked by the kick drum. So I'm actually going to load up a third-party reverb. This is called ROM from Native Instruments. It sounds like this. So that's without the compressor, and then here's with the compressor in, and the rest of the tracks in. Or you can try putting the reverb after the compressor, and this will give you a less drastic of an effect. Now, if you want a really, really drastic, almost gating ducking effect, what you can do is go into the sidechain input here and try switching the detection from RMS, which is sort of like an average detection, and switch this over to peak, especially if your sidechain source are drums. You're going to find that this is really going to increase the dynamic range of the gain reduction. So with RMS, let's check this out. So it's jumping from about -4 to like almost -20. If I put this on peak, watch what happens. It's jumping from no reduction all the way down to like -20 and even a little bit beyond that. So let me go ahead and do that for the bass as well. So I'll just switch this from RMS over to peak. So it really gets those instruments out of the way when the kick hits. So that's the sort of stereotypical sidechain compression ducking effect. Next up, let me show you a more practical mixing example. Sidechaining can be really helpful as a mixing tool as well, especially if you have one or more instruments that are sort of colliding in a mix. In particular, I find it helpful to duck the instrumental tracks of a song to make some room for the vocals. And I'm not talking about a really drastic effect like the previous examples. I'm talking about a really subtle ducking effect that just gets the instrumental out of the way, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 dB, just enough so that the vocals come through without having to raise the volume of the vocals. So when the instrumental arrangement gets really busy, what happens is the vocals tend to get buried. So you end up with, something maybe more sparse in the verses where the vocals come through just fine, but then in the chorus, they get buried. So I'm going to show you a trick I use all the time for this using sidechaining. So first, let me play you a little bit of this song. In the verse, the vocals are fine. They fit in the mix really well. Once we get into the pre-chorus and the chorus, they tend to get buried under the instrumental.
You've got your secrets, but they don't faze me. I see love in your eyes and trust in your smile. We've hit the bottom about 1,000 times. Never again. Just stay right here with me. When we tear down all these walls, just stay right here by my side. I'm never gonna let you fall. I'm never gonna let you just take it slow. Give it time. What's another year, another life? Tell me now under the setting sun. 'Cause when
Yeah, so the vocals are really getting buried here. I could automate the volume of the lead vocal up if I wanted to, but I really don't want to do that because I don't want the vocals to all of a sudden sound louder in terms of, the relative balance between the verse and the chorus. So there's different ways you can route this. One of the things I like to do is put all of my instrumental tracks in a track stack. Now, if you're working in Logic 10.7.5 or higher, you can now put summing stacks inside of summing stacks. So if you're working with Drum Machine Designer tracks or other tracks that are already inside of summing stacks, this will be really helpful for you. So I'm going to take all of my instrumental tracks and add them to a summing stack. And I'll just call this instrumental. So that's all of my instrumental tracks all in one track stack, all in one summing stack. And what I can do is I can put a compressor on this track, and I can assign a sidechain input for my lead vocal or maybe all of my vocals. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll take all of the vocal tracks and I'll put those in a summing stack and I'll use that as the sidechain source. Other times I'll just use the lead vocal. Now, my lead vocal here is actually split up over multiple tracks, so I'm going to be using a summing stack as the source either way. So going back to my instrumental track, I'll go to the compressor here, go to the sidechain input, and this time I'm going to go to bus, and I'm going to go to lead vocal here. So now the signal of this entire lead vocal stack is going to be a sidechain input source to control the amount of compression. Now, we're not looking for a ton of compression here. We're looking for maybe 1, 2, or 3 dB of compression when the vocals come in. Anything more than that is going to really sound like a noticeable ducking effect.
to waste, just take it slow. Give
And yes, I know I'm clipping over here, but you know, in a perfect world, you'd balance those things first. But just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to leave it alone. I think I'm going to make the attack and release a little quicker, just so it's a bit of a quicker effect there.
Out of time, you know we've got to grow up, create the seeds and sow them. I told you that we're running out of time. Just take us higher, so high we can touch the sun, and never let go, girl. Just break these chains before I'm gone.
So it's a really subtle effect, but all we're doing is just ducking the instrumental tracks every time the vocals come in. And again, we're only reducing that by maybe 1, 2, or 3 dB, something very subtle that doesn't sound like a ducking effect, but it's just carving out a little bit of space in the instrumental to make room for the vocals. Again, a very subtle effect. I want to wrap up this video by showing you one last creative sidechain effect. So throughout this video, I've only been using the compressor as the sidechain input, as the sidechain target. Right now, I still have that ducking effect on my bass track. This is the same example from earlier in the video. I've just removed the chords. So I still have the kick drum from this drum loop affecting the dynamic of the bass. But if I wanted to take this one step further, I could have the kick drum from this loop affect some parameter within the actual instrument on that track. So what you'll find is that some instruments, not all of them, but some instruments have a side chain input. And this includes some third-party instruments as well as Logic instruments. Instruments with sidechain inputs generally will allow you to use a sidechain source to control various modulation parameters within the instrument. This is similar to how you can set up a filter to be controlled with your modulation wheel, but instead you're just replacing the mod wheel with the sidechain input. So for example, in the ES2 here, I'm using the classic synth bass preset, and I've tweaked a couple things, but on the very first modulation router here, the target is cut off 2, so that's this knob right here. And then this is being controlled by a random control, and the source that's controlling this is envelope 2. So envelope 2 is what's causing the cutoff to move. So I can move around that cutoff knob and get different filtering effects. So the way you set this up is in the source of the router, you set this to max. And then in the via parameter, this would be like where you would assign your modulation wheel, for example. What I'm going to do is switch this over to sidechain. And then I'm going to click this little circle here, and you can set a range for the modulation. Now, at this point, I need to decide what I want my sidechain source to be. Obviously, I've only got one other track here, so it's going to be drums. So you can just go up to the sidechain source here, select your instrument or audio track. There it is, drums. Now, this doesn't have a filter on it. You're not filtering the sidechain source, but we'll live with it. I think it'll be fine. And then what I can do is set that range and play around with the position of the range, and also play around with the position of the cutoff until I get an effect I like. So you can hear that the filter is a bit more open when the kick hits, and the filter is more closed when the kick isn't hitting. And if I wanted that modulation to be inverted, I could click this little INV button, and now when the kick hits, we're going to have more of a closed filter and more of an open filter when the kick isn't hitting. So the kick drum in this loop, or really the entire loop, the volume of this is affecting this modulation router and causing the cutoff knob to change its position in a variable way. So those are some of my favorite sidechaining techniques in Logic Pro. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel to see more content like this. As always, thank you so much for the support, and thanks for watching.